On the tablet screen, her daughter's voice pierced the dark. "She won't even notice." Eric's laughter followed. "By the time she figures it out, it'll be too late." Margaret's heart pounded as she stared at the footage, her own family rifling through her drawers. Only hours before, Instagram had delivered the first wound, her daughter toasting on Christmas Eve, smiling with her mother-in-law, the caption bold: "Christmas with the family that truly matters." And the HOA notice sealed it: renovations at her house without her consent. She clutched the paper, whispering, "If they want a war for what's mine, they're about to lose." Then her phone buzzed. A notification. Instagram. Margaret wasn't someone who used it much, but Laura had once added her, "just so you can see the kids." Tonight, that tiny icon lit up with a new story. She tapped. The screen filled with laughter, glasses clinking, and her daughter Laura's smiling face beside her husband Eric. The caption read, "Christmas with the family that truly matters." Margaret's heart dropped. She turned the volume up as if she hadn't read it correctly. But then the video continued. Eric raising his glass, Laura giggling, their friends chiming in with the toast, "To family that truly matters." And in the background, her grandchildren, Sophie and Michael, singing along, oblivious. Her hand shook so hard she nearly dropped the phone. She had spent all day hoping, waiting, that someone would knock on her door or at least call. And now, here was the truth. Her daughter was hosting Christmas across town, and she wasn't even invited. She stared at the tree beside her, the card still unfinished. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. For a moment, she felt 12 years old again, standing outside her parents' farmhouse, realizing she wasn't welcome at the grown-ups' table. That old wound of rejection flared alive. "Family that truly matters," Laura had written. Margaret's breath hitched. "So I no longer matter. I gave her everything, and now I'm invisible." Margaret hadn't always been alone. Her late husband, Harold, had died nearly a decade ago, and since then her world had revolved around Laura and the kids. She'd helped pay for their down payment when Eric lost his job for a year. She'd picked up Sophie from school, sat in the freezing bleachers during Michael's soccer games, even when her knees screamed in pain. There had been times she'd skipped her own medical appointments to help them, and when her small CPA pension came through, she'd used a portion to clear their credit card debt, never mentioning the sacrifices to anyone. But lately, something had changed. Calls grew fewer, visits shorter. Laura seemed impatient, Eric more dismissive, and tonight the cruel confirmation. She was no longer seen as family, but as a burden. A week before, Laura had stopped by briefly to pick up some old toys. Margaret had carefully packed a bag of wooden blocks and stuffed animals, thinking the kids might want to keep them at her place for sleepovers. Laura had taken the bag, glanced inside, and scoffed. "These are too old, just keep them or toss them. Honestly, Mom, do you even know what kids like these days?" She'd shoved the bag back into Margaret's hands, leaving behind not just toys, but also a framed photo from 20 years ago. Laura, age 6, sitting proudly on her mother's lap, holding her first school certificate. Margaret had stared at the photo, confused. Why return it? Why erase the memory? Now, as she watched the Instagram story replay, that same ache twisted deeper. She put the phone down, clutching her cardigan tight. She wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe Laura hadn't meant it that way. Maybe it was just a careless caption. But then she remembered last Thanksgiving. At the dinner table, Eric had raised his glass and said loudly, "To the future, when we'll have more space and less clutter." His eyes had drifted toward Margaret's end of the table. Laura had laughed nervously, saying, "Oh, Mom knows what he means." At the time, Margaret had smiled faintly, choosing silence over conflict. But tonight, the puzzle pieces aligned, painting a picture she didn't want to see. They weren't just drifting away, they were pushing her out. The house felt unbearably quiet. Margaret stood, her knees aching, and walked toward the window. Snow had begun to fall outside, soft flakes catching the glow of streetlights. Somewhere out there, her family was gathered, warm, laughing, celebrating, while she stood alone, watching shadows on the glass. Her eyes landed on the mailbox outside, half buried in snow. She hadn't checked it today. Moving on instinct, she wrapped her shawl tight and shuffled to the door. The air bit at her cheeks as she stepped outside. She opened the mailbox and found a stack of envelopes, one with bold letters, Homeowners Association Notice. Curious, she brought it inside, set it on the table, and slid it open. Her eyes scanned the paper and froze. Unauthorized construction at 124 Elmwood Drive. Violation of HOA bylaws. Immediate remedy required. Elmwood Drive. That was her house. Her name was still on the deed, yet someone was making changes without her knowledge. Margaret sank into her chair, clutching the letter. The pieces clicked, sharp as broken glass. The caption, the neglect, the dismissal. And now this. Her daughter and son-in-law weren't just excluding her, they were moving against her, quietly, legally, as if she no longer existed. The phone buzzed again, another notification, a text this time. From Helen, her older sister. Maggie. I drove past your place today. There were trucks in the driveway. Are you doing renovations? Margaret's breath caught. Trucks? She hadn't hired anyone. Her chest tightened. Her mind raced. Something was happening behind her back. She looked at the glowing tree, at the half-written card for Sophie, and whispered into the empty room, "If they think I'm invisible, they'll never see what's coming." Before we dive deeper into this dramatic family story, make sure you subscribe to Silent Tear Stories and turn on the notification bell. Here, you'll always find tales of sacrifice, betrayal, and the twists no one saw coming. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below. Who knows? The next story might echo your own experience. Margaret sat frozen in her chair, the HOA letter trembling between her fingers. Trucks in her driveway, renovations under her name, and she hadn't even been consulted. She wanted to believe it was a mistake. Maybe Eric had misunderstood some paperwork, maybe Laura had assumed. But no. The caption from earlier still burned in her mind. Christmas with the family that truly matters. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan. The next morning, she decided to drive past Elmwood Drive herself. Her heart pounded as she turned the corner. Sure enough, 2 pickup trucks were parked in her driveway, men unloading bags of cement and stacks of lumber. She rolled down the window slightly, not wanting them to notice her, and saw Eric standing in the yard, gesturing grandly with his arms. Laura was there too, bundled in a designer coat, sipping coffee from a paper cup. Margaret pulled over just far enough to watch without being seen. She heard Eric's voice carry across the yard, booming with arrogance. "Once we knock this wall down, the whole place opens up. It'll be perfect for us." Margaret's stomach knotted. Perfect for us? She was still alive. She was still the legal owner. What gave them the right? She drove home, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles whitened. Every mile back felt like a betrayal replaying in her head. Times she had chosen them over herself. Times she had believed their smiles, their promises. That evening, Laura finally called. Margaret answered quickly, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Hi, Mom," Laura said, her tone hurried. "Listen, Eric and I are really busy with projects, so if we don't come by this week, don't take it personally." Margaret's throat tightened. She almost confronted her right there, almost said, "What projects? My projects? My house?" But she swallowed it down. "I see," she said softly. Laura sighed. "You've had a good run here, Mom, but things change. You should maybe start thinking about moving somewhere smaller, easier to manage." Margaret's hand trembled on the phone. There it was, the truth, laid out with false kindness. They wanted her gone. After the call, she sat in silence, staring at the photo of Laura as a little girl, the one she'd returned in that bag of toys. She remembered holding her daughter's hand on the first day of school, remembered staying up late to finish a costume for the school play, remembered patching her heart when Harold died, doing everything she could to keep the family intact. And now, Laura had erased her, just like she erased that photo from the home they'd once shared. The following week, things escalated. Margaret received a medical bill she didn't recognize, charges for treatments she had never undergone. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but when she called the clinic, the receptionist hesitated before saying, "Well, according to the paperwork, your daughter authorized these services on your behalf." Margaret's blood ran cold. Laura had claimed she was declining mentally and signed documents as her proxy. That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, papers spread before her. The HOA notice, the false medical bill, and the credit card statement that showed a $35,000 withdrawal she never made. Her breath came shallow, her chest tight, but beneath the panic, something else began to burn, a quiet fire of resolve. For too long, she had been silent. For too long, she had let her sacrifices erase her voice. But not this time. Not with her home. Not with her legacy. The next morning, she made an appointment with Richard Lawson, a lawyer she had once worked with during her CPA years. He greeted her warmly, but when she laid the documents on his desk, his expression hardened. "Margaret, this isn't just neglect," he said. "This is fraud. And if they're forging your signature, that's criminal." Margaret's lips pressed together. "They think I'm invisible, Rick. They think I'll just fade away quietly." He leaned forward. "Then we'll make sure they see you, loud and clear." Rick advised her to update her trust, to secure her accounts, and to install security measures in the house. "Do you still have cameras on the property?" he asked. Margaret nodded slowly. Harold had once installed them, though she hadn't checked them in years. That night, she dug through drawers until she found the old tablet linked to the system. She plugged it in, waited, and then there they were. Videos. Recent ones. Her breath caught as the screen lit up with images of Laura inside her living room, rifling through the filing cabinet. Eric stood nearby, glancing nervously toward the door. And then came the words that stabbed deeper than any knife. "She won't even notice," Laura muttered, pulling out a folder. "It's not like she checks this place anymore." Eric laughed. "Yeah, by the time she figures anything out, it'll be too late." Margaret sat in the dark, the glow of the tablet washing over her face. Her heart pounded, her hands shook, but for the first time in years, she smiled. Not from joy, but from clarity. They thought she was invisible, but invisibility was her shield. They'd never see her coming. She leaned back in her chair, whispered into the stillness of her home. "If they want a war for what's mine, they're about to lose." And somewhere deep inside, Margaret felt something shift. She was no longer just the abandoned mother, no longer just the quiet widow. She was the storm they never expected. Margaret woke before dawn the next morning. The images from the security footage still burned into her mind. Laura's dismissive tone, Eric's laugh, their hands inside her drawers as though her home was already theirs. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea she hadn't touched, feeling a steady drumbeat of resolve rise in her chest. For decades, she had played the role of the quiet mother, the accommodating widow, the dependable presence. Now, for the first time in her life, she felt something shift. She pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to write. Names, dates, amounts. Every instance of sacrifice. Every payment she had made on their behalf. Every slight that stung her into silence. It wasn't bitterness that drove her pen across the paper. It was clarity. She needed to see her life's record laid out in ink. By the time the sun rose, she had filled 4 pages. Later that day, she visited Rick Lawson again. His office smelled of leather and old books, the kind of place that seemed to anchor truth. She slid the pad across his desk. "This is everything," she said. "Every withdrawal, every payment, every insult I swallowed. And now this. HOA violations, forged medical bills, false claims of me losing my mind. Rick scanned the pages, nodding slowly. This is stronger than I expected. Margaret, they've overplayed their hand. Not only are they in violation of the trust, but if they're declaring you incompetent to seize control, that's legal fraud. A spark of disbelief flickered in her eyes. They wanted to erase me while I'm still breathing. They can't, he said firmly, but you need to be smart. If we go public too soon, they'll spin the narrative. You have to stay invisible a little longer. Invisible. The word no longer cut her. Instead, it became her strategy. Rick suggested a course of action. Quietly amend her trust to exclude Laura and Eric, secure her accounts, and prepare evidence. He also recommended she attend the next HOA hearing, where their renovations would be reviewed. Appear weak, Margaret. Let them believe they've won. Meanwhile, you're tightening the net. That night, Margaret called her sister Helen. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. I need you as a witness. If you see anything they're doing at my house, document it. Pictures, notes, whatever you can. Helen agreed immediately. You've carried them long enough, Maggie. It's time they learn who they're dealing with. Days passed, and Margaret kept her silence. Laura called occasionally, her tone syrupy sweet. Mom, are you feeling all right? You sounded confused last time. Margaret swallowed her anger and played along. Just a little tired, dear. Nothing to worry about. Each call was another brick in the wall she was building. One afternoon, the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Patterson, phoned. Her voice was concerned. Margaret, I saw Laura and Eric unloading furniture into your living room yesterday. Do you know about that? Margaret gripped the phone tightly, her eyes fixed on the silent house around her. Thank you, Helen, she whispered. Another witness, another nail in their coffin. She returned to the security footage, replaying the scene where Laura pulled files from the cabinet. Laura's words echoed, "She won't even notice." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, I noticed, and everyone else will too." Rick helped her file formal documents to freeze any changes to her accounts and to block power of attorney attempts. From now on, he told her, anyone trying to touch your finances has to go through me. But the turning point came not from the lawyer nor from the paperwork. It came from Margaret herself. One evening, after another call filled with Laura's veiled barbs about needing rest homes and lightening her load, Margaret hung up and stared at the family portrait still hanging in her hallway. Harold's face smiled back at her from the frame. She touched the glass gently. I've been silent long enough. If you were here, you'd tell me to fight, and I will. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. Instead, she felt an almost eerie calm settle over her. For years, she had lived waiting for love and respect to be given freely. But now she understood. Respect had to be earned, demanded, protected. The following week, she received another HOA letter, this time scheduling a mandatory hearing. Eric had apparently ignored the stop work order. Perfect. She marked the date on her calendar in bold red ink. January 6th. She made her preparations, updated her trust, gathered her witnesses, printed still frames from the footage. She even bought a new shawl, deep burgundy, the color of quiet authority. She rehearsed in her mind the words she might say. But more importantly, she prepared herself to face her daughter not as a mother begging for love, but as a woman defending her legacy. On New Year's Eve, Margaret received a final phone call from Laura. Mom, I hope you're not lonely tonight. Eric and I are hosting some friends. We'll try to stop by next week if we have time. Margaret smiled faintly into the receiver, her voice calm as stone. That's all right, Laura. I have plans. When she hung up, she whispered to herself, plans you'll never see coming. In that moment, Margaret was no longer the victim. She was the architect, and the blueprint of her quiet revenge was nearly complete. January 6th arrived with a sharp wind that cut through the bare branches outside Margaret's window. She stood in front of the mirror, fastening the burgundy shawl across her shoulders. Her reflection looked older than she remembered, but there was something new in her eyes, steel where there had once been softness. She whispered to herself, "This ends tonight." She carried her folder of documents, the still frames from her cameras, and the amended trust Rick had helped her prepare. As she stepped out into the biting air, a strange calmness wrapped around her. For weeks, she had been the ghost in her own life. Tonight, she would walk back into it, visible, undeniable. The HOA hearing was held in the community hall, but Margaret had arranged something else. She'd invited Laura and Eric to dinner afterward at her house, framing it as a belated Christmas meal. "It will be nice to sit down as a family," she had said sweetly. Laura had agreed quickly, no doubt anticipating more control, more silence from her mother. At the HOA meeting, Eric puffed up like a rooster. "These renovations are for safety. My mother-in-law can't manage the property anymore." His voice dripped with false concern. "We're just stepping in to help." Margaret remained quiet, letting him dig his own grave. When the chairwoman asked, "Mrs. Collins, do you confirm these renovations were authorized by you?" Margaret leaned forward and said clearly, "No, they were not." She produced the letter, the video stills, and the trust papers showing she had full capacity and control. The room shifted. Eric's face reddened. Laura's lips tightened into a thin line. But Margaret didn't linger. She saved the true storm for dinner. That evening, she set her table with care. A roast chicken glistened at the center. Candles flickered softly. And at the very middle of the table, she placed an empty chair with a small card that read, in delicate cursive, "Respect." When Laura and Eric arrived, their smiles were brittle. "Well, this is cozy," Laura muttered, scanning the table. Margaret poured them wine, her movements deliberate, calm. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to share something with you both." As they ate, Eric tried to make small talk, but Margaret interrupted. "Do you know what day it is?" she asked. Laura blinked. "January 6th?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes, it's also the day I stopped being invisible." She reached under the table, retrieved the tablet, and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of Laura's voice from the security footage. "She won't even notice. It's not like she checks this place anymore." Eric's voice followed. "By the time she figures anything out, it'll be too late." The footage showed them rifling through her files, Laura's smirk clear on screen. Laura dropped her fork with a clatter. "Mom, this is out of context." Margaret's voice cut sharp as glass. "There is no context in which stealing from your own mother is acceptable." She slid the false medical bill across the table, then the bank statement showing the missing $35,000. And here, fraud, theft, betrayal. Eric tried to speak, but Margaret raised her hand. "No, I've listened to your excuses long enough." Laura's face hardened. "You don't understand, Mom. We were protecting your interests. You're not capable of managing everything anymore." Margaret laughed, low and steady. "Not capable? I managed to raise a daughter who stands here today, ready to erase me for money. I managed to survive widowhood, illness, loneliness. I managed to save you when you were drowning in debt, and now you dare call me incapable?" She stood, her burgundy shawl catching the candlelight. "This house, this legacy, it's mine, and you are trespassing." Eric's jaw tightened. "You can't cut us out. We're your family." Margaret leaned closer, her voice calm but cold. "Family isn't written in blood. It's written in respect, and you've shredded that contract." She pulled out the final document, the amended trust. "As of last week, neither of you are heirs to my estate. Every cent, every brick of this house, every penny in my accounts goes into a scholarship fund for Sophie and Michael. They will have a future, but you—" She looked directly at Laura, then Eric. You will have nothing." Laura's face paled. "You can't do this. You'll regret it." Margaret's voice was steady, unshakable. "The only regret I have is waiting this long to stand up." Eric shoved back his chair, furious. "We'll contest this. We'll fight you." Margaret nodded, serene. "You're welcome to try, but the law is on my side, and so is the truth." For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the room. The empty chair with the word respect seemed to glow in the candlelight, a symbol neither of them could escape. Finally, Laura whispered, her voice trembling, "You'll end up alone." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "I already was alone. Tonight I'm simply correcting the record." The weight of her words crushed the room into silence. Laura's eyes darted toward Eric, searching for escape, but he had no answer. They left without finishing their wine, the slam of the door echoing like a final verdict. Margaret stood in the quiet dining room, her hands steady at last. She looked at the chair marked respect and whispered, "Justice served." Margaret closed the door softly behind her daughter and son-in-law, letting the silence stretch through the house. For a long moment, she simply stood still, breathing in the quiet as if it were the first real air she'd taken in months. The candles on the dining table flickered, casting long shadows across the empty chair marked respect. She whispered to herself, "Finally." The next morning, her phone erupted. Notifications stacked one after another, missed calls from Laura, voicemails from Eric, even frantic texts accusing her of betrayal. "How could you do this to your own family?" one message read. Another screamed in all caps, "We need that money, you're crazy." Margaret scrolled through them calmly, then set the phone down. For years, she had been the one apologizing, smoothing things over, carrying their burdens. Not anymore. She spent the following days securing her home. New locks on the doors, a new nameplate hung proudly by the front gate. Hart Legacy Home. It wasn't just a title, it was a declaration. This house no longer carried the weight of betrayal. It carried her legacy and the future she would shape. Helen stopped by with groceries one afternoon. She looked around the house, noticing the changes, and smiled. "You look lighter, Maggie, like you've shed 100 pounds of sorrow." Margaret chuckled softly. "Maybe I have." She poured them both tea. "For so long, I thought love meant sacrificing everything, even my dignity. But love isn't supposed to erase you. It's supposed to honor you." Meanwhile, Rick called with updates. "They tried to challenge the trust," he said, his tone almost amused. "But with the footage, the fraudulent bills, and your witnesses, they don't have a case. Honestly, Margaret, they'd be lucky if they don't face charges for what they've done." Margaret nodded, her voice firm. "Let them face whatever consequences the law sees fit. My fight isn't about punishment, it's about protection." The scholarship fund was established within weeks. Margaret wrote a personal letter to Sophie and Michael, sealing it in an envelope to be opened when they were older. She penned carefully, "One day when you're ready, you'll understand who protected you, even when others failed. My love for you is the truest inheritance I can give." The act filled her with a peace she hadn't felt in years. For once, her sacrifices weren't swallowed into silence. They were building a future that couldn't be erased. Months passed, and Laura never visited. Eric sent a few cold emails, all ignored. Sometimes at night, Margaret's heart ached with the absence of her grandchildren's laughter. But she knew she had drawn a boundary that could not be crossed. And boundaries, she realized, were another form of love. Love for herself and love for the truth. One Sunday morning, she walked to the local park where families gathered. Children ran across the grass, parents called after them, and the smell of hot cocoa filled the air. Margaret sat on a bench, watching the simple beauty of connection, and smiled. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was exactly where she needed to be. Looking back, she realized her daughter's betrayal had given her something unexpected: clarity. She could no longer live in the shadows of ungratefulness and manipulation. She could finally step into her own light. She thought of Harold, of the years she had leaned on his strength. She thought of the countless nights she had prayed for her family to see her. And now she understood. Respect wasn't given by blood. It was earned through love and kindness. And when that respect was denied, it was her duty to demand it. As she rose from the bench, a little girl skipped by, clutching her grandmother's hand. Margaret's eyes softened. She whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "Love doesn't mean letting people hurt you without consequence. Love means standing strong enough to remind them what family truly is." She walked home slowly, her shawl wrapped tight, each step steady with new purpose. And to those listening now, if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the very people you sacrificed for, remember Margaret's story. If you were in her place, how would you have reacted? Have you ever witnessed or lived through a betrayal like this in your own family? Share your experience in the comments. You may be surprised at how many people here understand your pain. Here, on Silent Tear Stories, every tale is a reminder that no one has to endure alone. We stand together, speaking out for dignity, for justice, for the respect every sacrifice deserves. So if this story touched you, leave a comment, maybe even a note to yourself, a promise that you will never let your worth be erased. And don't forget to subscribe to Silent Tears Stories, because here, every betrayal finds its twist, and every sacrifice finds its justice.